Good evening. I hope you and your families are safe and well as always. Tonight, we're going to continue our study in the book of Habakkuk. And let me just say up front, I'm very excited about what we're going to be covering tonight. So, just as a little teaser, we are going to look at perhaps the most important verse in the entire book of Habakkuk this evening. It's a verse that even if you've never read Habakkuk, you're probably familiar with this verse. It's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, and some have even said that Paul's entire letter to the Romans was grounded in part on this one verse that we're going to see tonight. So I hope that builds some anticipation and excitement for our time together this evening. But before we get to the text, I think it's going to be really important for us to do just a little recap and set the stage for chapter 2. So we have spent 3 weeks so far covering chapter 1, and a lot has happened already. And I think, again, the thing to remember about this book is that we are listening to a conversation between Habakkuk the prophet and God. And so far, the dialogue has already gone through a few steps, and we're not going to look at all of it in depth again tonight. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, go back and listen to parts 1 through 3. That will help you tremendously. But here's the basic rundown so far. Habakkuk starts off the conversation with God by taking a complaint to him. And remember, he's upset. He's upset because he's looked around and he realizes that his own people are wicked. His own people, God's covenant people. And he sees that God's law is ignored. People are practicing injustice. People are practicing violence and wickedness of all kinds. And Habakkuk knows this isn't okay. So he goes to God and he wants to know why God hasn't done anything to deal with all of it. He wants to know why God is just seemingly sitting on the sidelines. So God responds, and this was back in chapter 1, I think verse 5. God responds to Habakkuk by telling Habakkuk what he plans to do about it. And he tells him that he is raising up the Chaldeans. And again, we've looked in detail at who they were, but basically you can just think of them as a warring and conquering nation. And God tells Habakkuk that he is sending them to Judah as judgment on the wickedness of his own people. And a key thing to remember about this particular place of the conversation is that God speaks as if the people will be destroyed. He talks of the Chaldeans in such a way that leaves little doubt as to what is going to happen to Jerusalem and to his people. So this response from God provokes another complaint from Habakkuk. Habakkuk basically wants to know how God can do this. I mean, Habakkuk is perplexed and deeply concerned with God's plan. He wants to know how God can use the Chaldeans to punish Israel. They're a wicked people, and all they do is wreak havoc on anything around them. But perhaps more than that, Habakkuk wants to know how God can insinuate that Israel will be destroyed at the hands of these wicked people. Now, last week we spent a good bit of time talking about God's covenant he made with Abraham. And if you remember, I said that this was the key in understanding why Habakkuk has said some of the things he has. God had made an everlasting covenant with the people of Israel. But again, remember, he hadn't made the covenant just for the sake of Israel. In this covenant, he promised to bless the entire world. And we said in an earlier episode that the covenant God made with Israel was his rescue plan for the entire creation after the disaster that happened in Genesis 3. So for Habakkuk, all of this is in his mind. And if his people are to be eradicated at the hands of the Chaldeans, how would God keep his covenant with Israel? And if God doesn't keep his covenant with Israel, how will he bless the nations? And further than that, how will he fix this broken world? See, for Habakkuk, this all ties back into Genesis 1. See, Abraham is the means by which God has chosen to restore humanity to his image, to God's image. This is the only way the entire creation can be put back on the course that God intends for it. But if the Chaldeans eliminate God's covenant people, then what? See, for Habakkuk, this question is far bigger than just his own life, or even the life of his people. For Habakkuk, this issue has cosmic significance. God's covenant with Abraham was the promise to bless and restore all humanity, not just one people. But, see, for God, there's an apparent dilemma as well. His own covenant people were no different than all the pagan nations. As we saw from week 1, they worshiped all sorts of false idols and practiced injustice and wickedness. Instead of being a light to the nations as they were called to be, they were polluting and corrupting the nations. So for God, how could he let this wickedness go unpunished? For God, what would it say about his own character if he ignores sin within Israel but punished it elsewhere? So hopefully, with all of this in our minds, we can begin to see the dilemma a little more clearly. Habakkuk has asked God to punish the wickedness in Israel. God tells him he's sending the Chaldeans. But Habakkuk clearly didn't expect that plan from God, because he's now worried that God will destroy Israel. And that would mean God would abandon his covenant. So at the end of chapter 1 last week, Habakkuk directly challenges God. He wants to know how God can use the Chaldeans to punish those who are more righteous than they are. He wants to know, will the Chaldeans just continue slaying and conquering nations without God putting a stop to it? So, that brings us to chapter 2. And in this chapter, we're going to read God's final response to Habakkuk. And as I said up top, we are going to see one of the most important verses, perhaps in the entire Bible, in this chapter. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our text. And as I just mentioned, tonight we're going to be starting in chapter 2. So I'd invite you now to turn there with me if you want, or you can just follow along on the screen. Either way is fine. So starting in chapter 2, verse 1, we're going to read a little bit here. I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. All right, so that's just one verse. Let's just pause here just for a minute and see what Habakkuk is doing. Okay, first of all, this is Habakkuk speaking. God hasn't started his response yet. And the first thing I want you to notice is the language Habakkuk is using to describe how he will wait on the Lord. And he's waiting on the Lord to reply to him. Okay, keep in mind, he has just asked the Lord in the last chapter a very blunt question. He has directly challenged God. And now he says he will stand on the guard tower and wait. He will station himself on the rampart to see how God will respond. And I love this image. And by the way, if you haven't connected the dots, this verse was the inspiration for the graphic for this whole series. So again, shout out to Seth Hall for coming up with that image. But I love how this picture portrays this idea of Habakkuk as a watchman. He's at his post, surveying the horizon, intently looking out to see how God will respond to him. But what else I find interesting about this verse is what Habakkuk says he's going to do. He says he's going to wait on the Lord's response to him so that he can give a reply when he is reproved. Or some of your translations may say when he's rebuked. So it's clear here in this first verse of chapter 2 that Habakkuk expects the Lord to rebuke him. And this makes some sense, by the way. I mean, think about it. Habakkuk has just directly challenged God. He has questioned him and his purposes. And he expects God fully to rebuke him for it. So let's see what happens. What does God say in response to this waiting Habakkuk? Let's look at verse 2 and see what God says. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come. It will not delay. Okay, so that's verses 2 and 3. And the first thing I want to point out is the tone of God's response to Habakkuk. Now, again, we haven't read all of it, but you can already see here, and it's going to become even more clear as we continue, that God's response to Habakkuk is actually gentle. And that's not what Habakkuk was expecting, right? And it's important because keep in mind, Habakkuk was expecting a stern rebuke from God, and that's not what he gets. He actually gets a gentle response. So that should tell us something about God, and it should also tell us something about Habakkuk's questions that he asked. And it should tell us that, I don't know, maybe Habakkuk's questions weren't out of line. See, God has gently responded. But what has he said? Well, in these verses we just read, the Lord tells Habakkuk, he says how he's going to speak to him. And he tells him to record the vision, okay? He tells him to record the vision. And then he tells Habakkuk a little bit about what the fulfillment of that vision might look like. So let me just show you what I'm talking about here. Notice first he says to Habakkuk to record the vision and inscribe it on tablets. Now that's very interesting, and if you're reading this carefully, your ears may be perked up right there when you heard that. He tells him to inscribe the vision on tablets. Where else have we seen something similar to that in the biblical story so far? Yeah, so if you're thinking Moses and Mount Sinai, you were absolutely correct. You remember, Moses inscribed God's law on tablets. So whatever it is that Habakkuk is about to be shown by God, it is worthy enough to be recorded on tablets. And this is important because this tells us that the vision wasn't just for Habakkuk. See, Habakkuk's questions for God went beyond just himself, all right? Habakkuk was a prophet. And not only did the prophet speak on behalf of God for the people, at times they spoke on behalf of the people to God. So God is going to give a vision to Habakkuk, but it's intended to be given to the people. And the Lord makes this clear with the last bit of this verse. He says, inscribe it on tablets so the one who reads it may run. Now, I'll admit, this little bit here was extremely puzzling to me the first time I was reading it. What does God mean? So the one who reads it may run. What does it mean to run? And are we talking like running a race or like running scared? What does that mean? Well, I did a good bit of research here, and it seems that there is some debate even among the smart people too. But all the theories out there, there seems to be one I found that kind of makes the most sense, and it seems to be the most consistent within the context of the book. Basically, here's the idea. God is speaking about people who will proclaim the vision in the future, okay? He expects this vision to be proclaimed by future generations, and he's going to have prophets continually proclaiming it. So the idea is that the prophet, by the way, the prophets often are depicted in Scripture as running with the message that God has given them. So God has given him a divine word, and now he runs to speak it or to proclaim it. And the word for read here in the text, That's the word the author uses, but it can also mean proclaim. There are plenty of places where it means proclaim. So while the reading certainly fits, like the idea of reading the message, because it was inscribed on tablets after all, the idea of proclamation also fits. So the vision is to be proclaimed, is to be read and proclaimed by prophets continually into the future. Okay, so now we're going to come back to this idea of future. What are we talking about? Let's look at verse 3, because here God speaks about the timing of when this vision will come to pass. Okay, let's look at the text again. What does he say? For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it, for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Okay, so a couple of quick observations about this verse. First, it's clear that God is telling Habakkuk that the vision he is going to reveal to him will find its fulfillment in the future. He says the vision is yet for the appointed time, but then he says it hastens towards the goal and will not fail. Okay, so far so good. Like that makes sense, right? But then it gets a little bit tricky. Look at the next two lines. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come, it will not delay. Okay, now some of your translations may say if it tarries, wait for it. So we've been told that the vision will find its fulfillment in the future. Then we are told that it will not fail. But now we are told to wait for it if it tarries. And then to make things even more interesting, the final line says, for it will certainly come, it will not delay. So what are we to make of all this? We're told to wait if it tarries, but then the next line we're told that it's not going to delay. Now this may seem on the surface a bit contradictory, but I can assure you I don't think it is. This should clue us into something, and it should clue us into the fact that the vision is eschatological in nature. Now you're like, what does that word even mean? Okay, basically what that means is that this vision is dealing with how God will close out history, okay? This vision, whatever it is, it's going to shed light on how God will bring the whole story of redemption, the whole human story from Genesis 1 to wherever it's going. This vision is going to shed light on how God is going to bring that to a conclusion. So, with that said, what may seem like a very long delay for you and I, for humanity, it's not long and it's not uncertain from God's perspective. Okay? So now this should make sense, right? It should make sense that God would respond this way. I want you to think back again to what he's responding to. Think back to Habakkuk's final question that he asked in the end of chapter 1. Remember, basically he asked God, will the wicked continue to slay the righteous? Specifically, will the Chaldeans and those like them go on forever carrying out their injustices? So God tells Habakkuk, he's going to show him a vision. And he tells him to write down the vision so that generations following him will be able to read it and proclaim it. And he tells him not to lose heart, not to grow faint. If it seems like the vision is delayed or isn't coming, he assures him that the vision is going to come to pass at the appointed time. Okay. Before we move on, I want to point out a very interesting thing about this phrase we just looked at. And the phrase I'm talking about is the one that says, for it will certainly come. It will not delay. What's interesting is the Septuagint. Now remember, we talked about the Septuagint last week. The Septuagint, again, was the Greek translation of the Old Testament that many of the New Testament writers were using. So the Septuagint here when you read Habakkuk from the Septuagint, it translates this verse differently than the Masoretic text, which is what we're basing our translations off of. But the Greek Septuagint doesn't read, "For it will certainly come, it will not delay." Instead, it reads, "He will certainly come, he will not delay." And both translations are appropriate given the Hebrew text. Both translations, you could translate it either way. It's just a matter of what you think is what the author intended. And it's very interesting here because the Septuagint introduces what later Jewish rabbis and scholars have called a messianic hope. There's a messianic hope and expectation in Habakkuk's vision. But we're going to talk more about that later. I just wanted to show you right here in this verse that there's something interesting going on. And at this point, I can hear everyone asking probably the same question. You've probably been asking it for the last 5 minutes or so. And that's this question, okay, well, what is the vision, right? What is the vision that God gives Habakkuk? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at verse 4, which, by the way, is the verse I told you about from the outset. This verse is one of the most important verses in the entire Bible, okay? So let's just read what it says. Verse 4, "Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith." Okay, first thing I want you to see is this verse we just read is the content of Habakkuk's vision. The vision that God gave Habakkuk, this is the content of that vision. We are clued into that by the word behold, okay? It introduces, if you will, the substance of the vision that God has revealed to Habakkuk. So behold, this is the vision. So what is Habakkuk to behold? Well, God tells him, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. Or your versions, some of them may say, he is not upright. Now, here we should note that the text has in mind the proud or arrogant, like in general, like generally speaking, but specifically we can say that the Chaldeans are also in mind here, right? Remember, Habakkuk has asked, will the Chaldeans go on forever, slaying nations? And God says, behold, the proud are not upright. Now, it's clear that the Chaldeans have already been demonstrated to be proud and arrogant. Remember, they worship their own might. We're told that. They're boastful, they're puffed up. But there's something else that the text wants us to see. There are consequences. There are consequences to arrogance and pride. Here, actually, in this text. The text tells us that the arrogant are not upright, or that his soul is not right. And you see what's important for us to realize, I think, and this is what maybe the vision is telling us, is that appearances can be deceiving, right? You've heard that before, I'm sure. Take the Chaldeans, for example. They're proud. They're haughty. They boast in their own strength, in their own might. In other words, they look to themselves, right? That's ultimately where they look to. They look to themselves for their source of victory. They look to themselves actually for everything. And the problem with this is they won't find what they truly need there. What is it that they truly need? They need life. Life. See, the words of Habakkuk make it clear. The proud cannot be upright, and as a consequence of that, neither can they live. Now, I want to explain that because it doesn't explicitly say that. So how am I getting that? Let me walk you through a little bit here. It's not so much that they won't live because God is a big, bad, angry bully up in the sky who's looking to punish anyone who thinks too highly of himself. I think if we think that way, that's a misunderstanding of what the Bible is teaching about sin and its consequences. Don't get me wrong, there is an element of punishment, absolutely. Sin is inviting the punishment from God, but let's think about it a little bit differently as well. Think about Genesis 3 with me for a moment, all right? You're familiar with that story. Before Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate of the tree they weren't supposed to, God told them, In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, many people see that simply as God threatening to punish them with death if they don't follow his rules, which many people think are just arbitrary. But again, that's not the way to see the text, I don't think. Instead, we have to understand, again, who God is and what our proper relationship should be to him. So God is the creator, first and foremost. He is the creator. He is the source of all things. In fact, he is the source of all life. I've mentioned this before to some, and I think one of the attributes of God that we often don't talk about enough, but it's one that theologians call divine aseity. Okay? Divine aseity. And this simply means that life itself is an attribute of God. He doesn't acquire life from a source outside of himself. No, life flows from his very being. And he, by the way, is the only person in all existence that has this attribute. It's God. So, hold that in your minds. Now let's think again. If sin is rebellion against the Creator, if sin is a rejection of God, okay, in directional terms, if sin is humans moving away from God, what else then are humans moving away from? They're moving away from life. So if God is the source of life, right? He is the source of life. So when we sin, we reject who God is, and we invite death into our own lives because we're moving away from the very source of life. So it's clear that the prideful, they look to themselves for their own justification. They rely on themselves for their own lives, but in the end, only God can give life. And that's why the prideful cannot live, because they've put themselves in the place of God, who is the only source of life. So Habakkuk is told, as for the proud one, his soul is not right. But, and pay close attention here, what else is he told? But the righteous will live by his faith. Now, this is the verse that many of you are probably familiar with. If you haven't read it here in Habakkuk, then you've probably read it in Romans, because Paul and the author of Hebrews, by the way, they quote this verse directly. And there's so much to say about this verse that I don't even really know where to begin, honestly. I think the first thing maybe I want to do is show you how this contrasts to the previous statement, okay? So Habakkuk is told, as for the proud one, his soul is not right, but the righteous, he will live by his faith. So clearly, the proud are being contrasted with the righteous. It's clear that the proud could also be called the unrighteous. And it's also clear that God is telling Habakkuk that the righteous shall live. Okay, in other words, the righteous man, he will be given life, contrasted to the proud man who will not live. Now, this makes sense again in the context of what we've read so far. Habakkuk is afraid of what the coming of the Chaldeans means for the people of Israel. Right? He's already asserted boldly in the last chapter, we will not die, talking about the people of God. Remember, he's thinking about God's covenant with Abraham, and he's boldly claimed that God would not destroy his people of promise. And now we have God affirming what Habakkuk has actually said. He says, the righteous shall indeed live, but the wicked, they won't. Which again, this answers Habakkuk's previous question when he asked God if the Chaldeans would go on forever slaying nations. And God here answers by lumping the Chaldeans in with the proud. They will not go on forever. Why? Because they're not upright. They're prideful, they're arrogant, therefore they can't live, they can't continue to live. But the righteous, he shall live by his faith. Now, this still leaves a ton of questions, I know. Like, for example, what does it mean to be righteous? Who are the righteous? How does one become righteous? And what role does faith play in all of this? And all of these, by the way, are excellent, excellent questions. But they will take a good bit to unpack. So here's what I want to do. For tonight, I want to stop and just highlight a few important things that we've seen so far. And first, I would want to just recognize again that God's response to Habakkuk is gentle. Okay, he doesn't unleash fire and fury on Habakkuk for questioning him. Instead, he responds in a way that offers hope. Now, you may say, how exactly does this vision offer hope to Habakkuk? Well, what I want to point out is this. Habakkuk basically finds himself in the same boat that Abraham found himself in long before. You may say, what do you mean by that? Let's think back to that story just for a moment. Remember in that story, God made a promise to Abraham. You remember what he promised him? He promised to bless him, yes, and specifically, he promised to give him a son. But Abraham struggled with that. Why? Well, because his wife, Sarah, was well past childbearing age. So Abraham struggled with waiting, this idea of waiting for God when it seemed like this is impossible. It's impossible. Why would we wait? But God had made a promise, and he would fulfill it at the appointed time. So you see, in Abraham's story, there was tension. There was tension between God's timing and man's timing. And Abraham had a choice. Would he believe God or not? And even though it's a little bit rocky there for a while, ultimately he does. He does believe God. Scripture tells us Abraham believed God, and it says God reckoned it to him as righteousness. And we'll come back to that more next week. But for now, just notice the similarities. Habakkuk is struggling with an issue of timing. God, when will you judge the wicked? How long, O Lord? Remember, that's his initial question. How long, O Lord? How long will you let the wicked go unpunished? You see, the tension is found between God's promise and the fulfillment of God's promise. See, it's found in the period of waiting, if you will. And Habakkuk finds himself squarely in the place of that tension. He knows what God has said. He knows he will judge the ungodly. He knows he will vindicate the righteous. He knows he will make good on his covenant promise to his people. But in the present time, what does he see? He sees the wicked Chaldeans on the march. He sees them coming to swallow up a people more righteous than they. And he sees them threatening to erase every promise God made to his people. And to make matters even more puzzling, he is told by God that God is the one who's raised them up. But God assures him. He assures him here in chapter 2, the promises, they still stand. Just as with Abraham, the righteous shall live by their faith. And the arrogant, the prideful, they will fall into ruin. And this leaves Habakkuk, and honestly anyone hearing this message, with a choice. Will we believe God or not? When our circumstances would lead us to believe that God, maybe isn't in control, or when the things happening in the world and in our lives would lead us to think that God has abandoned us or doesn't care, will we choose to believe that? Will we choose to take matters into our own hands, as the prideful always do? Or will we choose to still believe that God reigns and he will do what he has said? See, Habakkuk was told to write the vision plainly and clearly. The prideful and the arrogant, despite what it may seem like in the present, their destruction and their ruin, it's certain. And despite what it may seem like in the present, the righteous man, he will find life through his faith in God. So, I kind of want that to sit with each of you this week. I want you to ask yourselves how you will respond to the tension, right? Because we all feel it. We all feel the tension. Yes, things aren't as they should be, right? We recognize that. Yes, the wicked and the unrighteous may seem to have the upper hand, but will you choose to believe God still reigns? Will you choose to believe God is still good and God is still faithful? Or will you choose to rely on yourself and trust in your own way? Again, this is a choice each of us will make for ourselves. For those who choose to rely on themselves, you may enjoy a moment here and now. But let me tell you, eternity is a long, long time. So I'll leave you with this. As Habakkuk was told, even though it may seem delayed, though it tarries, wait for it. For he will certainly come. He will not delay. So for those who trust in God, we eagerly await the return of our King. Jesus will come again, and he will put all things right. He will make all things new, and he will judge each and every one of us. So my prayer is that on that day, you will be able to stand in the judgment. And the only means by which that can happen is if your faith is in someone other than yourself. And his name is Jesus. So as we close, examine your heart. Are you among the proud and the arrogant who trust in yourself alone? Or can you humbly say that your only hope in finding life is if Jesus gives it to you? So I'll leave you with that question to think about until next time. I pray you and your families have a safe and blessed week. We'll see you again soon.